Hello everyone, this is the Insider Threat Podcast, an ISO 3103 1980 compliant show where we explore issues with the human factor and its impact on security and business. I'm your host, Steve Higdon. In this episode, we explain phishing, cover some recent news like crack, and more. Don't touch that dial. Welcome back. This is episode 23 of the Insider Threat Podcast for the week of October 23rd, 2017. Now, I'm sick as a dog today, so if you hear something funny about my voice, that's probably it. I wonder where that came from, sick as a dog. Well, anyway, so this is probably going to be a shorter podcast. We had more feedback, which I'll cover later, and I think that wraps up the announcement. So, it's time for your InfoSec question of the week, where Google is king and the prize is non-existent. The question last week was, in 1952, the first compiler came into existence. What famous person created it, and what other very noteworthy technological advancement did they take part in? The answer was Grace Hopper. She was also involved in developing the programming language COBOL. Grace Hopper was a cornerstone of both the IT and information security industries, in addition to what she symbolizes for women in tech. To this day, you'll still see people wearing t-shirts at conferences with Grace Hopper's picture on them. Congratulations to Rich from Virginia, Gerald from Illinois, Simone from Kentucky, and Abby from Maine for getting the correct answer. Here's your question for this week. In 2003, David Heinemeier Hansson created and has since maintained a key capability that has programmer happiness as one of its key principles. What did he create? Send your response to infosecanswer@gmail.com. Be sure to include your first name, location, and the hashtag #ChuggaChugChooChoo. So this week's discussion topic is phishing. First, you have to ask yourself, what is phishing? It's a form of social engineering, and it's primarily, when we think of phishing, it's an email with either attachments or links. So the links will go to maybe a malicious website for drive-by downloads, or it could also have a fake login screen for something like Google or Facebook or your company's intranet portal. As far as the potential attachments, now these can go all over the place. We've seen recently that some malicious Google Docs have come out, and they'll actually take advantage of the Google Chrome browser. But there's others, like Microsoft documents, that have macros enabled, and those macros will have a way to compromise the machine. And they typically use files that just about everyone uses. Another example is PDFs, because it's less likely to set off alarms when the malicious files look like those that are used for everyday business. Another type of phishing that you've probably heard of, or at least you should have, is spear phishing. So what spear phishing is when the attacker is actually specifically targeting an individual in your organization. This could be anybody really, but a lot of times it's the sysadmins, knowledge managers, or someone else that would have access to a lot of data. There was a term called whaling that came out, and it's not as popular anymore from what I've seen, but that was actually targeting the executives in the company or finance. But even then, it's still just a spear phishing attack. The next type of phishing attack, which you may have heard of as well, but maybe not, is called vishing, which is phishing except over the phone. I have a hard time using the new terminology of phishing or vishing, because it just sounds to me like regular social engineering that we used to see all the time. You know, someone would call over the phone and trick you into giving up your password or some network information, any kind of information that the attacker could use to compromise systems. On the other hand, I've also heard of some purchasing scams, and what they'll do is they'll call and you pick up the phone and they say, "Can you hear me all right?" And then you say yes. And that yes triggers some sort of purchase order or service offering. And they'll actually use the phone company or the phone system to bill you like a per minute thing. So think the 1-900 numbers in this case. They'll take the audio recording of you saying yes, and they'll stick it into, would you like to pay this service for this amount of money? And they'll put your yes after it, and that's their quote-unquote proof that you accepted this charge. The next form of phishing is smishing. So this is SMS-shing, I guess. And this is done over text messages. Now this is very similar to normal phishing, where it goes over email, but it's using the text messages, and you have a much harder time. You know, when you get a link in an email or something like that, and you can kind of hover over it to see where, or you should be anyway, you should be hovering over it to see what the link actually goes to. And on the same token, you can see very clearly the full email address of the person who's sending it, so you can tell if it's coming from an external person. In smishing over SMS, it's much harder to do this sort of investigation. And we're so quick these days as a culture to respond to text messages as soon as we get them. It's kind of part of our habits, you know, our hourly, maybe minute routine for some of you, and me included. It's much less likely that we're going to take the time required to investigate it and make sure it's legit. And finally, there's business email compromise, and this is definitely the worst of them all. So this is where an attacker is able to either break into your email client or your Exchange server, or they are able to compromise someone's account on the Exchange server and send what absolutely looks like a legitimate email to somebody asking for either data or maybe to wire some money if it's in the finance department or something like that. And the worst part about business email compromise is there are no direct protection solutions. There's just not. However, we do have sort of your defense in depth solutions. So even if we can't tell if an email is actually coming from inside of your organization and it shows up in your mailbox, it looks legitimate. Hopefully you have solutions or processes, methodologies in place to detect these with your SIM, with your user behavior analytics solution, and other security solutions and access controls to protect both your security boundary and your firewall. The bottom line for that is that if someone is able to compromise this, then another key part of your security program had to have been compromised as well. So here's the part that's most important to me, and it's why we're here. I've outlined the problem. Now, how can we fix it? How can we protect ourselves against phishing attacks? And there are some technological solutions like isolation methodologies where if a user clicks on a link, it opens up kind of a sandbox browser isolated from the rest of the system. And it'll even point out if this is a fake login screen or something like that. And if there's malicious code on the website, it's rendered useless because the solution actually recreates the website in a way where any sort of malicious code is dropped. You can have security configurations in place where maybe macros for Microsoft documents are disabled by default. Or you can disable completely any sort of active code from running in the browser, things like ActiveX, which are very often used to compromise users over the web. We're not here to go too much in depth on the technological solutions. After all, it is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So we need to talk about that. What is cybersecurity awareness? That's essentially just making people aware. Problem is, that doesn't actually fix it. If you go and you ask anybody today, anybody who's ever been on the internet, ask them if they've heard of phishing, they're going to say yes. Sometime in their life, they've heard of phishing. Now, did that actually make them change their actions? Did that have an impact on the way they do their business? Probably not. Or not all the time anyway. So the difference here is between awareness and education. And I've talked about education or training as being one of the key pillars of insider threat protection. So I guess we should go over it again. What is education, or what's an effective education or training program when it comes to insider threat? You're not just making them aware of the problem, but you're also giving them step-by-step instructions on how to make sure that the issue doesn't happen to them. Here's the ways that you can actually protect yourself. You know, like we said earlier, hover over that link. Make sure that it's coming from where you think it's coming from. Double check the email address or the person on the phone or the person that sent you that text message to make sure, one, you know who they are, and two, you're actually willing to give them this information that they're asking for. And then even more importantly, what do they do when they see something that looks suspicious? You have to have very concrete reporting procedures, and you have to make sure they know it. and you have to make sure they're able to, let's say they can't memorize all the reporting procedures. Well, they have to have a place that they can go to get those reporting procedures at any time in case something comes up. Because I don't know about you, but if I'm in the middle of my workday and I'm jamming on something, maybe in my case, it would be a security policy document, and I've been going on this for 45 minutes, and all of a sudden I get this email or I get a link or something like that, I don't have time. I've got a deadline that I've got to get this, at least initial draft of the security policy done. I don't have time to hunt around for an hour trying to find what I'm supposed to do as far as reporting something that looks suspicious, asking my coworkers, all that stuff. That makes me an hour behind at my job. So you have to make sure the reporting procedures are available to everybody. Maybe even a sticker on the top. If something looks crazy, call this number, and it goes to your, probably the help desk, maybe even the InfoSec people. And here's the kicker, and some of you may not like me for saying this. It needs to happen more often than just October of every year. Cybersecurity Awareness Month is great for getting the information out there. It's for getting people focused on information security and training for a month to get people thinking about it. That's huge. And I really like that, obviously. But it's definitely not enough. Good education needs to be ongoing. And I think I've mentioned it before. I've seen an organization where every time you log in, it presents the user with a single security question. And it's something they can easily Google, and it's something they can turn to their person in the next cube over and say, hey, did you see this? Did you get the answer to this already? It's okay if they cheat. In fact, it's encouraged if they cheat, because that means either one, they're researching a big security problem over the internet, or two, even better, they're talking about it with the people that they work with. So it's not about getting the correct answer. It's about getting people thinking about security every single day. That's what makes the biggest impact in my mind when it comes to information security education and training for the users. So what are you doing this month for Cybersecurity Awareness Month? What are you doing for your education programs? Do you have any sort of creative ways that you're getting the message across to the user base so that maybe they won't click on that link, or maybe they won't open that attachment, or maybe they won't get a phone call from someone they think is the head of finance telling them to wire some money? Because I'm telling you, it sounds silly. This happens every single day. People are out a lot of money just because of a phone call or an email, something that looks urgent, saying that they need to wire $1 million, $2 million, $3 million worth of money for some sort of tech procurement or something like that. What do you do to make sure that doesn't happen? I am all ears for this, because I'm really excited to hear of interesting and creative ways that we're getting the message across in an effective way. For our news this week, it's not as much talking about the news. Maybe it's talking about the way that we address big security news in our industry. So we had Crack and Raqqa, and I'll get more into each of them in a second. I'm sure you've heard of the Crack vulnerability. It was highly publicized. It had a lead-in for something like 2 months. The people who discovered it were like, hey, on this date, we're going to be giving you some crazy mind-blowing information. And they went again, hey, on this date, we're going to give you this crazy vulnerability that's so widespread and it's going to destroy the world. It comes complete with a logo, a website, and even t-shirts. I'm serious about that. Google it. There are t-shirts out there for this Crack vulnerability. And if you haven't read more about it, there's some very good write-ups out there, and they can do a much better job than I can. But here's my take. You have to be in Wi-Fi range to exploit it, right? It doesn't impact communication over things like VPN or encrypted web traffic, or think HTTPS. Therefore, it's not quite as big of an attack as I initially thought it was. The attack surface is pretty low, and the impact isn't quite as much as what the headlines and Twitter, especially on Twitter, kind of made it out to be, especially at first. I mean, personally, when I first heard about it, I was kind of torn. Part of me said, this is going to ruin the world. Every single one of us is vulnerable. Nobody, and I mean just about nobody, patches their Wi-Fi routers or, flashes the firmware to make sure it's up to date. I don't know many people who do that. Now, I've done it recently just because of this, but I don't remember the last time I did it. So what makes you think the average user, and that's a loaded term these days, but what makes you think the average user is actually going to go out and flash the firmware on their router? It's not going to happen. So the best chance is to patch the clients, which is much more easily done. I mean, most devices that connect to the internet today, and I say most for a reason, looking at you, IoT, most of these devices have the ability to update themselves, or at least allow you to update them fairly easily. So I was torn between, there's no way that we're going to be able to help ourselves because nobody patches these things. And then maybe my better judgment, or we'll just call it my curmudgeonness. I just created that word. I don't know if it's probably not real, but we'll just go with that. My curmudgeonness was telling me that I've seen a lot of hype about this. And before I'm going to get overly excited, I better learn a little bit more about it. Because everybody was blowing up all over the place. I mean, every single news outlet was talking about it. Every single tech outlet was talking about it. I have Google Alerts set up to email me anything about information security, new articles when they come out. It's a way that on top of Twitter, how I keep up to date on security issues around the world. And I said, there's just way too much going on about this. So you wait a week, and all of a sudden you start seeing the real write-ups come out saying, maybe this isn't quite as important as we thought it was. Sure, it's a big deal. It really is. As far as trust goes, because for a long time we've trusted that WPA2 is safe and it's the best that we can get with AES encryption and all this stuff. So maybe the trust goes down quite a bit because of this, especially, until the manufacturers start to get all the patches out there. Other than that, and one of you said, if you see a person with a hoodie standing in your front yard with a laptop, you might have bigger problems than them just being able to intercept or man in the middle some of your encrypted communication over Wi-Fi. Now let's take Raqqa, or the return of Coppersmith's attack. Now this one got over my head really quickly as far as the cryptography and stuff like that goes. I got my CISSP, and I did decent on the encryption or cryptography domain of that, but that was in 2012. And although I have a full respect for cryptography and a general understanding of it, I am nowhere near an expert. So I'll try to dumb this down to the level that I can understand it. How about that? Imagine a world where all the trust that we have in public key cryptography, and remember with PKI, you have your public key, which you can give to absolutely anyone, and then your private key, which you keep yourself. And whenever you're going to do any sort of communication with somebody else, encrypted communication, you'll exchange public keys, and you can actually use those. You can use the other person's public key to decrypt the message that they're sending from their private key, and vice versa. Now, what if you found out that the key part of that encryption, the fact that you cannot get the private key if you have the public key, like you can't use the public key to kind of derive what the private key might be? What if that's been broken for the last 10 years? This is a very serious vulnerability. On Paul's Security Weekly, or maybe it was Startup, it was one of the Security Weekly podcasts, Paul even mentioned that I wonder if law enforcement is going to go back now, and some of those hard drives that they haven't been able to crack for, involved in cases for the last 10 years, they can actually now, using this vulnerability or exploiting this vulnerability, they can decrypt them. And there's a good chance of that, by the way, because I'm sure there's a lot of those ever since people started, or criminals, or, just people in general, not just criminals. I won't lump everybody into the whole criminal bucket. As long as people have started using cryptography effectively, so that's definitely within the last 10 years, right? I'm sure there's a lot of evidence out there. And so let's go beyond law enforcement. How about in our own organizations? The way that we've encrypted things may be broken. So as I said, this one actually is serious. But you know what? There were almost no headlines. There's no website for it. There's no logo. And I tried as hard as I could to find a t-shirt for the Raqqa vulnerability, and it just wasn't out there. So what does this say about our industry and marketing? We're marketing these now. Maybe it's just aligning with every other successful industry out there, where they'll blow up something just to get it really exciting and get everybody on board. Take the hype factor all the way up to 10. And usually that's done in other industries in order to sell a product or something like that. In this case, and I don't know, I may be a terrible person for saying it, this sounds like a security conference talk. We're going to do all these crazy things, and then maybe, and I did read the website for the researchers that actually did find this, and a lot of it just looked like, hey, look at this awesome thing that we did. We did responsibly disclose the information. That was a whole 2-month thing. But it looks like they were trying to generate the hype that would get them and maybe their organization talking at conferences and as a marketing thing for their organization, much more than a marketing thing for the actual vulnerability. On the other hand, I don't know. Anytime you get information security in the major headlines for something that's not a breach, that might be good too. It gets people thinking about it. It gets people talking about it. As we were talking about with the Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Maybe there's no such thing as bad publicity when it comes to information security. What do you think? I think we took this whole discussion about the news about these vulnerabilities to another level, a much deeper level on, is this what we can expect for every vulnerability that might be widespread but might not be that much of an impact from here on out? Tell me what you think. Am I off base? Probably. So now we have a new segment this week, and I'd like to keep it up, so that's going to depend on you guys. This is our listener feedback segment. And for listener feedback this week, one of you told me that the new format and structure is much easier to listen to. So thanks for that, of course. And I'm still tweaking some things here and there, but I think it'll be nice to have a main topic for each episode so listeners can go back and listen to a specific one that might match something that they're currently dealing with in their own organizations. So again, thanks for the feedback and keep it up. Our thought of the week comes from Grace Hopper herself. She said, "A ship in port is safe, but that's not what ships are built for." Thank you for listening to episode 23 of the Insider Threat Podcast. Please remember to subscribe and review in your favorite podcast app, and also share with everyone you know. Those reviews are key to building this out and improving for later episodes, so please feel free to leave suggestions. You can contact me on Twitter @Steve Higdon or send an email to steve@theinsiderthreatpodcast.com. Join our Reddit community and discussions at the subreddit named Insider Threat. The subreddit is also where you'll find the show notes for this and any other episode, as well as links to the topics we've covered. If you go to our website, you can also find a link to our Patreon page, and you can subscribe to the newsletter to get up-to-date information on current episodes and news for the show. Call and leave a voicemail at 443-292-2287 to get a comment added to the show or even ask a question. Thanks again, and I'll see you folks next time.